The Alexander technique asks a question: what am I doing that is interfering with my proper functioning? The Alexander technique was developed by a man named F. Matthias Alexander in the late 1800s, and he was an Australian actor who found that he lost his voice on stage when he got to the more important or emotional parts. And he was kind of stumped by that. He thought, you know, he's a trained actor, why is he always losing his voice? So he did something. He set up some mirrors that would show him from many different angles, and he sat in a chair and observed himself. And he did this experiment for over 10 years, just watching himself in a mirror. And he would watch himself get up out of a chair and sit down and do certain things. And he noticed that every time that he went, for example, to get out of the chair, he had the same physical response. He shortened his neck and he pulled his head back. And so he started to ask the question, well, maybe I'm doing something that's interfering with my natural functioning. Maybe when I'm on stage at those key emotional points, maybe I'm doing something that's getting in my own way, which back at that time was a pretty radical thought. And so he pursued this and he started to think, okay, let's say that's true. How can I help other people with that? And he developed a technique whereby he used his hands and he used his thoughts to inhibit in another person going into the habit.
Yes, the problem he sensed was how difficult it is to change a response pattern. We can have very deep understanding and many shifts around the story, but to change the instantaneous defensive mechanism that protects our lives is extremely difficult to work with. And I mean, for anybody to explore themselves and literally look at themselves and observe, that wouldn't be my way of doing it, for 10 years, what was happening, and not be able to change that, no matter what he tried. The harder he tried, the more difficult it was. It got worse. And so he pursued a methodology gradually where he was able to inhibit the response pattern began to happen. And that's what an Alexander teacher does. He helps the client or the pupil inhibit the moment they're about to do something. You know, that instant feeling of the instant reaction. That's the key moment where the Alexander teacher comes in and does, and it prevents. To allow something new to happen, or something more efficient and a functional kind of way to happen in that instant. So that is the essence to this day of the Alexander technique, to prevent that bad habit, in quotation marks, so something new can happen.
Okay, so that's the Alexander technique. Focusing you're familiar with, developed by Gene Gendlin in the 1960s at the University of Chicago, based on Carl Rogers' client-centered therapy. The premise being that if we allow the way we are in this moment to be just that way, then change is possible. And Gendlin introduced the piece of listening inwardly to a bodily felt sense connected to our lives that's unclear. Philosophy, or the premise behind focusing, might be inside ourselves we know how it should have been, or we know how it could be, that we have the blueprint within ourselves. Alexander technique found it was impossible to change the habits. Focusing says that inside someplace knows how we could be.
Yes, and there's a connection here between focusing and the Alexander technique, insofar as both realized that inside ourselves there was a knowing, and both realized that came from the whole self, and that you had to allow something, and that was very different from the mainstream thought. Rather than intervention or to try to stop anything, you actually allowed something new, something to unfold. But they did it from two different directions. One was to prevent a habit and replace it with something else. And then we'll hear from whole body focusing, and particularly, but also from focusing, is to embrace the habit, to make room for it, and out of the habit comes the body wisdom for the next right step in our lives. And for the whole body focusing, that is experienced in a whole body, a physical kind of way. It is actually a lived experience. And you'll see, hopefully we'll see it and experience that this afternoon. This is what we want to give you, if we can.
And so in whole body focusing, we say that the movement itself is the handle out of which the more can come.